With the overturning of Roe v. Wade, abortion rights have become a priority within state legislatures. We spoke with delegate and UVA professor Sally Hudson on the climate of reproductive rights in Virginia and how she views this issue moving forward. What inspired you to run for the House of Delegates and now the state Senate?
I first ran for office back in 2019, and that was a really exciting time in Virginia politics. At the time, Democrats had been shut out of majorities in Richmond for years. And going into that election, it seemed like Democrats were finally in a position to take back the House and Senate. And that meant that Democrats would finally get to govern. We'd had Democratic governors forever, but we hadn't had Democrats in the legislature. And this district in Charlottesville is one of the strongest Democratic districts in all of Virginia. And I think that means it has a job to do. I think this has to be a leadership district for Virginia to really push the pace on the kind of progressive change that we can get out of Richmond. And so I ran in 2019 to be one of those delegates who would help Richmond really step up to the kind of progressive Virginia that I think that we have become, but had been shut out of for a long time politically.
From the perspective of being an elected official, what does it mean to be one of the last Southern states to have access to abortion and then to be actively defending them?
I think a lot of us knew this day was coming for a long time, which is why so many of us felt pressure to do all the good work that we've done in the last 2 terms to make Virginia a safe haven for abortion in the South. I felt this really serious pressure to get that work done quickly because it wasn't at all clear to me that Democrats were going to hold on to majorities for a long time or that our federal protections were going to be there for the long haul. Because it turns out those doomsday predictions came true, that DC did roll back our rights at the federal level. And so we're now counting on those state protections that are in place.
One of the bills that you've introduced, the House Bill 2097, would secure emergency contraception for sexual assault survivors, and it recently received opposition on the floor in regards to the violation of the Conscience Clause. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of this bill and then to some of the points of opposition that were made on the floor?
This is a bill that came to me directly from nurses in our community who treat sexual assault survivors in emergency rooms. And the challenge that they encounter is that emergency contraception comes in several different forms, depending on how you present, depending on where you are in your ovulation cycle, depending on your size. For some people, an oral emergency contraceptive like Plan B or Ella is the appropriate course of treatment. But for others, the most effective form of emergency contraception can be an IUD, which is a more expensive treatment to administer. And right now, the Virginia Crime Victims Fund does not cover the cost of IUDs if they're administered in conjunction with another medication. Sometimes when they're not really sure where you're at in your cycle, the providers will do both just to be safe. And so what the bill would have done would be to require that the Virginia Crime Victims Fund cover those IUDs when a provider indicates that that's the appropriate course of treatment. In addition, what the bill would have done is address the question you raised about the Conscience Clause. In Virginia, we already have a law in the books that says that an individual doctor never has to write a prescription for emergency contraception if it violates that physician's moral or religious standards. And that can pose a problem if you're a patient who shows up in an ER and you want emergency contraception, and the doctor who's on duty that night says, I don't do that. What we tried to do in this bill was to find a happy medium and leave the individual conscience clause in place, but mandate that hospitals have a backup plan in place if they have providers who want to exercise their conscience clause. So maybe you've got an individual doctor who's not willing to write that script, but the UVA hospital would have to have a plan for somebody else who's willing to step in if you have a doctor who's wanting to step out. The frustrating reality of working in reproductive healthcare is there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of advocacy organizations that aren't really interested in having a conversation that's rooted in healthcare facts.
I think just going back to some of the points that you made earlier and also just working with a lot of college-age students, a lot of students who are now able to vote. Could you just talk about the role that young voters play, especially in this age of policy, as well as reproductive rights?
There has never been a better time for young voters to make your voices heard, because some of the things that affect you most are the biggest topics on the ballot this year. And the good news is that Virginia has become a much more friendly place to young voters, because in the last couple of years, we've passed laws that make it easier for young people to register where they live, especially if they're students. We now have something called same-day registration, which means that you can walk up to your polling place on election day and register on the spot. You don't have to register by some arbitrary deadline in advance. So I think it's super important that students make their voices heard. It's also never been a time to be there's never been a better time to be a student voter in Virginia.
As you continue your campaign for the state Senate, what are you most looking forward to?
I'm really glad to be done with the legislative session, be back home so we can be talking to people and stirring up all those good ideas that could become law very soon.
I'm Zoey Brooks, WVA.